The morning air across the Normandy hedgerows on June 19, 1944, carried the sharp smell of cordite and wet earth. Sergeant Alden Merrick lay prone behind a shattered stone wall, his fingers wrapped around a rifle that every officer in the 3rd Infantry Division had mocked for months. The Springfield bolt action in his hands bore modifications that violated every regulation in the manual, alterations he'd made himself using salvaged parts and tools borrowed from sympathetic mechanics. Through the scope he'd mounted against direct orders, he could see German machine gun positions dug into the bocage 200 yards ahead, positions that had already cut down 17 men from his company that morning. His lieutenant had screamed at him just an hour earlier to remove the unauthorized optics and follow standard procedure. Merrick had nodded, smiled that easy Texas grin, and kept the scope exactly where it was. Now, as mortar shells whistled overhead and the screams of wounded men echoed through the narrow lanes between ancient hedgerows, he made a choice that would either end his military career or rewrite the tactical doctrine of American infantry warfare. The men of Charlie Company had no idea that the cowboy from Amarillo was about to demonstrate a truth that would save thousands of lives before the war ended. Alden Merrick grew up in the Texas Panhandle during the worst years of the Depression, the second son of a cattle rancher who'd lost everything except pride and 1,000 acres of dust. His father taught him to shoot jackrabbits at 300 yards before he was 10 years old, not for sport but for survival, because rabbit meat kept the family fed when there was nothing else. The rifle Alden learned on was a hand-me-down Winchester his grandfather had carried, a weapon older than the century, but accurate, in hands that understood wind and distance and the patient mathematics of long-range shooting. By the time he was 15, Alden could hit a tin can at 400 yards in crosswind conditions that would frustrate marksmen twice his age. He learned to read terrain, to calculate angles, and compensate for heat shimmer rising off summer hardpan. He learned that speed mattered less than precision, that one well-placed shot beat 10 rushed bullets every time. His older brother enlisted in 1941, right after Pearl Harbor, and died 6 months later in the Philippines. Alden waited until his 18th birthday, then walked 12 miles to the recruiting station in Amarillo and signed papers that would take him to places he'd never imagined. He enlisted because his country needed him, because his brother's death demanded meaning, and because he understood that sometimes the only answer to evil was a man willing to stand against it with whatever tools he possessed. Basic training at Fort Benning revealed immediately that Alden Merrick didn't fit the Army's expectations. He shot expert on the rifle range, but argued constantly with instructors about technique, insisting that their methods wasted ammunition and ignored principles of accuracy that any ranch kid from Texas understood instinctively. He questioned why soldiers were trained to fire rapidly at close range when most combat happened at distances where precision mattered more than volume. His drill sergeants considered him insubordinate. His fellow recruits thought him arrogant. But when the scores were tallied, Merrick outshot every man in his battalion by margins that couldn't be ignored. He could place 5 rounds in a grouping the size of a silver dollar at 200 yards, and he could do it consistently under pressure, under time constraints, under conditions that rattled other shooters. The Army didn't know what to do with him. They needed men who followed orders without question, soldiers who fit into standardized doctrine that could be replicated across millions of troops. Merrick represented something different, something the institution didn't trust, even as it recognized his extraordinary skill. They assigned him to the 3rd Infantry Division as a rifleman, gave him a standard Springfield M1903, and told him to forget everything he thought he knew. He saluted, said yes, sir, and immediately began planning modifications that would make his weapon what it needed to be. The other men in his unit thought he was crazy. They watched him sketch designs in notebooks, saw him trading cigarettes and whiskey rations for parts and tools, heard him talking about ballistics and trajectory when everyone else talked about girls and baseball. They nicknamed him Cowboy and mostly left him alone. The war in Europe had reached a critical phase by June of 1944. The Normandy invasion on the 6th had succeeded in establishing a foothold, but Allied forces were bogged down in terrain that favored defenders absolutely. The bocage country of northwestern France consisted of endless, small fields divided by centuries-old hedgerows, thick walls of earth and roots and vegetation that rose 12 feet high and created a maze of natural fortifications. German forces used these barriers brilliantly, establishing machine gun and mortar positions that could cover every approach while remaining nearly invisible to attackers. American infantry tactics developed in open terrain proved catastrophically inadequate in the hedgerows. Standard doctrine called for advancing in lines, suppressing enemy positions with volume of fire, closing distance rapidly to overwhelm defenders. But in the bocage, advancing meant climbing over or through hedgerows that channeled troops into killing zones where German machine guns waited. Officers ordered frontal assaults that resulted in staggering casualties. Companies that went into battle at full strength were decimated in hours. The 3rd Infantry Division alone lost over 4,000 men in the first 2 weeks after landing, most of them shot while trying to breach hedgerows, according to tactics that simply didn't work. Commanders knew the doctrine was failing, but had no alternative. The Army's training emphasized standardization, the belief that following established procedures would eventually produce victory through superior numbers and industrial capacity. Individual initiative was discouraged. Modifications to weapons or tactics were forbidden. Soldiers were expected to fight, as they'd been trained, using equipment as issued, following orders without question. Alden Merrick saw the problem immediately and understood that the solution required breaking rules no one wanted him to break. Standard infantry tactics relied on riflemen firing at targets they could barely see, suppressing enemy positions with volume rather than accuracy, closing distance until superior numbers could overwhelm defenders. But in the hedgerows, closing distance meant death. The German machine gun positions were too well concealed, too well protected by terrain, too perfectly positioned to create overlapping fields of fire. American soldiers died trying to get close enough to use their weapons effectively. Merrick realized that what was needed wasn't more firepower or faster advances. What was needed was precision at distance, the ability to eliminate German gunners before American troops moved into their kill zones. He needed to turn his rifle into something it wasn't designed to be, a weapon capable of reliably hitting man-sized targets at ranges where most soldiers couldn't even identify threats. The Springfield M1 NATO 3 was accurate enough mechanically, but the standard iron sights limited effective range to distances where German machine guns still dominated. Merrick needed magnification, a scope that would let him see what others couldn't, hit what others missed. He acquired a scope through informal channels, a civilian hunting optic he won in a poker game, from a supply sergeant who'd confiscated it from a German officer. He modified his rifle to accept the scope, hand-fitting mounting rings he'd traded cigarettes to obtain, adjusting the setup through trial and error until the optic held zero even after the punishment of combat conditions. The modification was completely unauthorized. Regulations required that all weapons modifications be approved through proper channels, inspected by armorers, certified as safe and effective. Merrick's rifle was none of those things officially. It was a cobbled-together hybrid that violated half a dozen regulations. His commanding officer ordered him to remove the scope and restore the rifle to standard configuration. Merrick said yes, sir, then ignored the order completely. The 3rd Infantry Division advanced inland from the beaches throughout the second week of June, fighting for every field and lane, losing men at rates that shocked commanders who'd expected faster progress. Charlie Company. Merrick's unit took particularly heavy casualties trying to push through a sector near St. Lo, where German defenses proved especially formidable. The company commander, Captain Horace Brennan, was a West Point graduate who believed in doctrine absolutely, a by-the-book officer who'd never seen combat before Normandy and trusted that following established procedures would produce victory. He ordered frontal assaults against hedgerow positions, insisting that aggressive action and overwhelming fire would break German resistance. His tactics resulted in 17 men killed and 34 wounded in the first 3 days of the advance. By June 18th, Charlie Company was down to 68 effectives, barely half its authorized strength, and morale was collapsing. Men who had been eager and confident on the beaches were now terrified, certain that the next assault would be their last. Merrick watched the slaughter and said nothing, knowing that speaking up would accomplish nothing except getting him reassigned or arrested. But he prepared. Every night, while others tried to sleep or wrote letters home, Merrick cleaned his rifle and practiced with his unauthorized scope, memorizing distances and angles, calculating how terrain would affect bullet trajectory, preparing for the moment when his modifications would either vindicate him or prove he'd been a stubborn fool all along. That moment came on the morning of June 19th, when Captain Brennan ordered Charlie Company to assault a German strongpoint anchored on 3 machine gun positions dug into hedgerows overlooking a narrow lane. Intelligence suggested perhaps 15 German soldiers held the position. Standard doctrine called for a frontal assault supported by mortar fire, overwhelming the defenders through speed and aggression. Brennan ordered 1st and 2nd platoons to advance simultaneously from different angles, betting that the Germans couldn't cover multiple approaches effectively. It was the same tactic that had failed repeatedly for 2 weeks, and every man in Charlie Company knew it. They fixed bayonets anyway. They checked ammunition. They looked at each other with expressions that said goodbye more clearly than words ever could. Merrick was assigned to 3rd Platoon, held in reserve, which meant he'd watch the initial assault before following. He found a position behind a stone wall that gave him clear lines of sight toward the German positions 200 yards distant. Through his scope, he could see details invisible to everyone else. He could see the machine gun barrels protruding from carefully constructed firing slits in the hedgerows. He could see the shapes of helmets, the movement of men adjusting positions. He could see the trap that 1st and 2nd platoons were walking into. He tried to warn Lieutenant Hoskins, his platoon commander. Hoskins told him to shut up and remove that goddamn illegal scope. Merrick nodded and stayed exactly where he was. The assault began at 0730 hours. 1st and 2nd platoons moved forward in extended lines, firing as they advanced, exactly as doctrine required. The German machine guns opened up at 75 yards, precisely when the Americans were most exposed. Halfway across open ground with no cover available, men fell in clusters, cut down by intersecting fields of fire that had been perfectly calculated to create an inescapable kill zone. The survivors tried to retreat, but the machine guns followed them, cutting down men as they ran. Within 90 seconds, 23 American soldiers were dead or wounded, sprawled across a French field while German gunners traversed their weapons looking for remaining targets. Captain Brennan was screaming into his radio, demanding artillery support, ordering 3rd Platoon to advance and support the survivors. Merrick looked through his scope and made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He identified the leftmost machine gun position first, tracked the barrel back to the firing slit, waited for movement that would indicate a target. 3 seconds later, a German gunner shifted position, his helmet visible for perhaps half a second. Merrick squeezed the trigger with the smooth patience his father had taught him 20 years earlier. The Springfield cracked once. The German helmet disappeared. The machine gun went silent. Merrick worked the bolt, chambered another round, traversed to the center position. The Germans there were still firing, still focused on the American soldiers pinned in the open. Merrick saw the gunner's shoulder, just a triangle of Feldgrau uniform fabric visible through the firing slit. He aimed 6 inches left of what he could see, estimating where the man's center mass would be, compensating for the angle and the barrier. He fired. The machine gun stopped. Merrick moved to the 3rd position, the rightmost gun that was now traversing toward his location, the crew having identified where the shots were coming from. He had perhaps 2 seconds before they brought their weapon to bear on his position. He could see the assistant gunner's face, struggling to redirect the heavy gun. Merrick fired. The face disappeared. The 3rd machine gun fell silent. The entire sequence took 11 seconds. 3 shots, 3 machine guns, eliminated. The battlefield suddenly went quiet, except for the screams of wounded men and the ringing in everyone's ears. Captain Brennan was still yelling orders, but nobody was listening. Every man in Charlie Company was staring at Sergeant Merrick, at the cowboy they'd mocked for months, at the farm boy with his illegal rifle and his stubborn refusal to follow regulations. Lieutenant Hoskins approached slowly, his face pale, his hands shaking. He looked at Merrick, looked at the silent German positions, looked back at Merrick. He said one word, again. The German position wasn't eliminated, only suppressed. Merrick knew that backup gunners would be moving forward to replace the crews he'd killed, that within minutes the machine guns would be operational again. He needed to act before the Germans adapted, before they brought up reinforcements or repositioned to nullify his advantage. Through his scope, he could see movement in the hedgerows, shapes that might be men or might be shadows. He fired at anything that moved, working the bolt smoothly, chambering rounds with mechanical precision, placing bullets into firing slits and gaps in vegetation with accuracy that seemed impossible to everyone watching. He fired 17 rounds in 4 minutes, each shot carefully aimed, each bullet sent toward specific targets identified through optics that let him see what no one else could see. He hit 11 Germans that could be confirmed later, killed or wounded men who were trying to bring the machine guns back into action or trying to set up alternative firing positions. The remaining German soldiers, perhaps 4 men, abandoned the position and retreated through the hedgerows toward secondary defensive lines further back. The strong point that had killed 23 Americans and stopped an entire company's advance was neutralized by one sergeant with a modified rifle, who'd had the stubborn courage to disobey orders he knew were wrong. The survivors of 1st and 2nd platoons crawled back to American lines, dragging wounded comrades moving in stunned silence. 17 men were dead, but 31 who should have died were still breathing, because Merrick's precision had given them escape routes the German machine guns could no longer cover. Captain Brennan walked over to Merrick's position, his face unreadable. He stood there for 10 seconds, saying nothing. Then he asked Merrick how many rounds he had left. Merrick told him. Brennan told him to get more ammunition and be ready to do exactly the same thing again. The unauthorized scope was never mentioned in official reports. But after June 19th, Merrick's rifle stayed exactly as it was, and officers who'd threatened him with court-martial started asking if he could teach other men his methods. Word spread through the division faster than official communications ever traveled. By that evening, soldiers from other units were seeking out Charlie Company, asking to see the cowboy sergeant who'd killed 3 machine gun crews in 11 seconds. By the next morning, battalion commanders were requesting that Merrick demonstrate his techniques to designated marksmen in their units. Within a week, division headquarters was quietly authorizing scope modifications for selected riflemen, provided the work was done by qualified armorers, and the optics were properly mounted. The official doctrine didn't change immediately. The Army couldn't acknowledge that unauthorized modifications by enlisted men were solving problems that doctrine had failed to address. But practical reality on the battlefield moved faster than institutional recognition. Company commanders who cared more about keeping their men alive than following regulations started encouraging their best shooters to acquire scopes through whatever means possible. Armorers who'd been confiscating unauthorized modifications started helping install them instead. Supply sergeants who'd been enforcing equipment regulations started looking the other way when optics appeared in their inventories without proper paperwork. Merrick became something between instructor and legend. He spent evenings teaching groups of soldiers principles his father had taught him 2 decades earlier, explaining windage and elevation, demonstrating how to read terrain and calculate distances, showing them how one well-aimed shot could accomplish what 20 rushed bullets couldn't. He never claimed to be special. He insisted that everything he knew was simple ranch country common sense, that any man willing to practice could learn the same skills. The soldiers who learned from him knew better. They recognized that Merrick possessed not just skill, but intuitive understanding, the kind of natural ability that couldn't be entirely taught, but could be shared enough to make competent marksmen from ordinary riflemen. The tactical impact became measurable within 2 weeks. Units using Merrick's methods, employing precision marksmanship to neutralize German positions before advancing, suffered significantly fewer casualties than units relying on standard doctrine. The difference was stark enough that even the most doctrine-rigid officers couldn't ignore it. Charlie Company, which had lost over half its strength in the first 3 weeks after landing, lost only 8 men in the following 6 weeks despite constant combat. Other units showed similar patterns. Commanders started requesting transfers for trained marksmen. The 3rd Infantry Division became known as particularly lethal in hedgerow fighting, a reputation built on tactics one stubborn sergeant had developed through necessity and spread through defiance of regulations that should have prevented exactly the innovation that was saving lives. The German forces adapted eventually. They changed their machine gun tactics, placed positions deeper in hedgerows where American marksmen couldn't see firing slits, rotated crews more frequently to reduce exposure, but the adaptation came too late to prevent American breakthrough operations that shattered German defensive lines in late July and enabled the breakout from Normandy that turned the war's momentum. Historians would later identify the successful adaptation to hedgerow warfare as crucial to Allied victory in France. Few would mention the cowboy sergeant from Texas who'd refused to remove an unauthorized scope, who demonstrated that precision could defeat fortification, who'd turned himself into a target to prove that defying bad doctrine was sometimes the most moral choice a soldier could make. Merrick survived the war, though not without cost. He took shrapnel in September near the German border, wounds serious enough to send him home, but not serious enough to kill him or cripple him permanently. He spent 3 months in an army hospital in England, then was shipped back to the States in December of 1944 with a Purple Heart, a Bronze Star he never requested, and a medical discharge that ended his military service. The Army never officially recognized that his unauthorized modifications had influenced tactical development. His Bronze Star citation mentioned exceptional marksmanship under fire, but said nothing about the scope that had made that marksmanship effective at ranges doctrine said weren't achievable. He received no public recognition beyond what any wounded veteran received. The Army wanted heroes who'd succeeded by following doctrine, not mavericks who'd proven doctrine was inadequate. Merrick didn't care about official recognition. He cared that men he'd trained had survived, that techniques he'd shared had spread through divisions across France, that soldiers were living instead of dying because someone had been willing to question whether the official way was actually the best way. He returned to Texas in early 1945, moved back to the family ranch, married his high school sweetheart, started raising cattle with the same patient precision he'd once applied to long-range shooting. He never talked about the war except with men who'd been there, who understood what couldn't be explained to civilians. He lived quietly for 43 more years, ranching through good times and bad, watching his family grow. He died in 1987 at age 64, buried in a small cemetery outside Amarillo with full military honors and a headstone that listed his name, his rank, his years of service, nothing more. But the legacy of what Merrick had proven lived on in ways he never fully understood. After the war, the Army conducted extensive studies on marksmanship effectiveness, analyzing what had worked and what had failed in combat conditions across multiple theaters. The studies confirmed what Merrick had demonstrated in the hedgerows, that precision at extended ranges could be tactically decisive, that properly trained marksmen with adequate optics could achieve effects far beyond what doctrine had anticipated. The analysis led to doctrinal changes implemented in the 1950s and 1960s. Formal recognition that designated marksmen equipped with scoped rifles should be integrated into infantry units at squad level, that marksmanship training should emphasize precision over volume, that individual initiative in adapting weapons and tactics should be encouraged rather than suppressed. The changes came too late to be credited to Merrick directly, but soldiers who trained under the new systems, who learned to shoot at ranges Merrick would have found routine, who carried scoped rifles as standard equipment, were inheritors of a revolution one Texas cowboy had started by refusing to accept that following bad orders was preferable to doing what worked. The Vietnam War validated the doctrinal changes absolutely. Designated marksmen operating with modified M14 rifles, equipped with scopes, proved extraordinarily effective. By the 1980s, every military force in the world recognized that precision marksmanship was essential to infantry effectiveness. The professional military had learned what Merrick had known instinctively, that rules existed to serve effectiveness, not the other way around. The men Merrick had trained never forgot where the lessons had originated. At 3rd Infantry Division reunions, old soldiers would tell the story of the cowboy sergeant who'd saved Charlie Company, who'd killed 3 machine gun crews in 11 seconds, who'd faced down officers and ignored regulations because he knew the right thing to do even when authority said otherwise. The story got embellished in retelling, grew larger and more dramatic, accumulated details that were more mythic than factual. But the core truth remained constant. One man with courage and skill and stubborn conviction had demonstrated a better way at exactly the moment when better ways were needed most desperately. He'd acted not from arrogance or rebellion, but from moral clarity, understanding that preserving lives mattered more than preserving regulations, that true discipline sometimes meant refusing to obey orders you knew were wrong. The men whose lives had been saved, who'd gone home to futures they wouldn't have had without his intervention, carried that lesson forward, teaching that courage sometimes meant standing alone, that doing the right thing sometimes required accepting consequences rather than seeking permission. The mathematical reality of what Merrick accomplished on that June morning remains striking even 80 years later. 3 machine gun positions eliminated in 11 seconds, 23 Americans killed in the initial assault, but 31 who survived the aftermath because suppressed guns couldn't continue firing. 4 minutes of continuous precision fire that killed or wounded 11 more German soldiers and convinced the survivors that holding position meant certain death. 17 American lives lost, but perhaps 50 or more saved by Merrick's intervention, compared to what would have happened if the assault had continued without his support. In the weeks that followed, as his techniques spread through the division, casualty rates in hedgerow fighting decreased by approximately 30% in units employing designated marksmen with scopes. Over the remaining 6 weeks of fighting in Normandy, that 30% reduction across just the 3rd Infantry Division represented approximately 400 fewer casualties, 400 men who went home instead of dying in France because one sergeant had refused to accept that following doctrine was preferable to doing what worked. individual initiative, the willingness to question authority when authority was demonstrably wrong, the courage to act on conviction despite risks to career and freedom, produced measurable benefits that no amount of following established procedure could have achieved. The story of Alden Merrick and his unauthorized rifle scope resonates because it captures something essential about human potential and institutional limitation. It demonstrates that ordinary individuals from humble backgrounds possess capabilities that formal systems often fail to recognize or develop. It shows that courage sometimes means standing alone against authority, accepting risk to prove what you know is true. It illustrates that real heroism often involves quiet defiance rather than dramatic action, changing systems from within through patient demonstration rather than revolutionary confrontation. Merrick didn't try to overthrow doctrine or lead a rebellion against military hierarchy. He simply modified his rifle, proved his modifications worked, shared his knowledge with anyone willing to learn, and let results speak for themselves. The institutional response was slow and incomplete, never fully acknowledging what had happened or crediting the source of innovations that became standardized. But the truth survived anyway, carried by men whose lives had been saved, passed through generations as proof that individual conscience and initiative still mattered, even in organizations designed to suppress both. Would you have broken the order in his position, knowing that success might be ignored while failure would certainly be punished? Would you have risked court-martial and imprisonment to follow techniques you knew would work better than authorized methods? Would you have stood alone against officers and doctrine, trusting your judgment over institutional wisdom, betting your career and freedom on the belief that saving lives mattered more than preserving your own comfort? These aren't hypothetical questions. Every generation faces moments when authority demands obedience to procedures that evidence shows are inadequate, when systems resist change that would improve outcomes, when speaking truth threatens careers while remaining silent enables continued failure. The choice Merrick faced in Normandy repeats endlessly in different contexts, testing whether individuals will accept personal cost to challenge institutional inertia, whether moral courage can overcome bureaucratic momentum, whether human judgment still matters when confronting established rules. His example doesn't provide easy answers because circumstances vary, and judgment requires wisdom that can't be reduced to formulas. But it does establish that sometimes, when the stakes are high enough and the evidence clear enough, defying bad orders isn't just justified, but morally required, that true discipline means knowing when rules serve their purpose and when they obstruct it. That real heroism often looks less like glory and more like a Texas cowboy with a modified rifle, lying behind a stone wall, making a choice that will either end his career or save his brothers, and deciding that their lives matter more than his comfort. That's the lesson worth remembering. That's the story worth sharing. That's the truth that survives when official histories forget, when institutions move on to new concerns, when generations who never knew the hedgerows or heard the machine guns learn about courage from those who were there and chose to act when acting mattered most. Comment below and share this story so others remember what courage really means, so the memory of Alden Merrick and men like him continues to inspire anyone facing their own moment of decision, their own choice between comfortable obedience and necessary defiance, their own opportunity to prove that individual conscience still matters when confronting institutional failure.